Welcome to the lecture series of Public Theology, a cooperation of the Berlin Institute for Public Theology, the Bayersnau Decipher for Public Theology, and the Lutheran World Federation.
Greetings, friends. My name is Munther. I'm the pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem, and I'm also the academic dean at Bethlehem Bible College. In this presentation, I will be giving a perspective into peacemaking from my own experience as a Palestinian who has been living in this land for all my life, and inspired not just by my faith, but also from my activism and from the writings and conferences we do as related to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I begin by emphasizing that most of my perspective will be coming from the Sermon on the Mountain. To me, this has been one of the most important discoveries, not just in my life, but in my writing and in my thinking. And as I said, I will keep bringing my talk back into reality in Palestine and Israel. For many years, Christians engaged with this conflict from multiple aspects, maybe from the international law. Some evangelicals focus on end-time theology. And as I was trying to understand what does the Bible say about the promised land, the God's people concept, I discovered that the most important passages in scripture that guide me in terms of how to live here, how to engage with the Palestinian-Israeli reality, is what I found in the Sermon on the Mountain. And it's there where I was challenged, but it's there also where I found the roadmap. In concepts like love your enemy. I mean, it's so challenging, but what does it mean? And is it applicable? In concepts that when Jesus spoke about standing up and facing the oppressor and turning the other cheek to him, engaging with the humanity of your oppressor, in my situation, the occupier. When Jesus says, do to others what you want others to do to you, Jesus' concept of what I call shallow religiosity, and so on. So what does it mean to be a peacemaker? I think it's really important to remember that Jesus calls us to be peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. I mean, this is serious. This is the mark of the kingdom people. These are the marks of the sons and daughters of God. They seek peace. But let's remember that when Jesus said this, he probably meant more than just if your neighbors are not talking to one another, then go and invite them to coffee or so on. Because Jesus said these words in a politically charged environment. And as such, they carry so much weight. Whenever we think of the Beatitude, the concept of the meek who inherit the earth or the land, thirsting for justice, the merciful. Again, let us remember that Jesus said these words in a context of an empire that occupied this land, in a context of uprisings and constant struggles. And it's there that he emphasized peacemaking, being thirsty for righteousness, for justice, being meek, being merciful. So the question is, do we take Jesus seriously enough? Do these things work? And it's often when I speak to young people here, whether students or in youth groups, they ask me, these things don't seem to be realistic. And I say, did Jesus mean them? It's either he had no idea what he was talking about, or he's calling us through a radical way. And so rather than accepting that things will never change, I choose to try to engage with Jesus' teachings and the Sermon on the Mountain. My talk will be structured into these 7 points. Blessed are the peacemakers. Peacemakers first. Listen, understand, and discern. Second, they are compassionate. Third, peacemakers step into the other side of the wall, and I will explain what I mean by that. Peacemakers take sides, speak truth to power. Number 5, peacemakers seek justice. Number 6, peacemakers engage the humanity of the aggressor. And 7, peacemakers go beyond ending the conflict. So let me go through them one by one. My first point is that peacemakers should listen, understand, and discern. I'm often shocked and surprised by how often Christians take very quick positions without actually studying, listening, and discerning. And to discern, you must ask the right question. Why are people angry at one another? What is driving this? And I think when I say sometimes we just prefer easy solutions, it's because we fall into the trap of stereotypes. It must be good versus evil, and why do people do this? Probably because they have an ideology that teaches them to hate, and so on. I've seen this all the time. So many times Christians, when it comes, for example, to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, take sides without listening, without understanding. They simply assume if Palestinians are Muslims, then that must be the problem. And we frame conflicts into, good versus evil, us versus them, without actually asking the right question. Well, how did we get here? Why are, for example, Palestinians demonstrating? So we should avoid easy questions, easy solutions, and we should always ask. We should always seek to understand what is happening. And one of the things I want to emphasize in peacemaking is the power of stories. Because at the end of the day, it's about real people. Engage and listen to stories from real people, but do this in a sense of compassion. And that leads me to the second point. To be peacemakers, you should care. You should care about people. You should care about lives. You should care about how the living conditions of people. And sometimes we should even more. We should be moved by compassion when we see suffering and injustice. And again, I had to learn this the hard way in this land. Because oftentimes we engage with Christians who, and I use the word here, apathetic. They just don't care. And there is this what I call false religiosity, in which we think the church is a place just to worship. And when pilgrims come to the Holy Land, they come to visit historical places and the Church of the Nativity and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I always wonder, do they care about the situation in this land? Do they care that there are millions of Palestinians who are living under occupation, who are still living in refugee camps since 1948? And I'm troubled because to come, by the way, I don't know if you have the chance to visit us in Bethlehem, to visit the Nativity Church where Jesus was born, you have to go through a checkpoint, then drive next to the wall, drive by a refugee camp just to visit the church. And again, as I see one bus after the other come to our city, I wonder, do people care? And I always say, if you want to do something, religious in this context, do what Jesus did. Talk to people. And we can't just look at the situation and say, it's unfortunate, as I've heard so many times. Christians should not and cannot just say it's unfortunate, but we should engage. Jewish theologian Abraham Heschel is famous for saying the opposite of good is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference. And so if we truly seek to be peacemakers, we should listen, we should understand, listen to stories, and we should be compassionate. We should care. I often use the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus challenges this shallow religiosity in which two religious people walked by a wounded person and did nothing. Did nothing probably because they were busy, They were on their way maybe to a conference on worship or on doctrine, but they had no compassion. They might have said it's unfortunate and walked by. And so we should care. My third point is that peacemakers step into the other side of the wall. And this is more than just listening to both sides of the story, because oftentimes we listen to one side of the story or we elevate one side over the other. But what I say here, that peacemakers step into the other sides of the wall, to me the wall is more than just a physical concrete structure as in our land. The wall is an ideology. A wall is an ideology that begins by promoting the lie that people who are different than one another cannot exist with one another. And this is usually promoted by those who are in power, and they seek to separate, to disengage. And so these walls are built, and these walls are constructed before they are built. In other words, they are here, they are inside of us when we believe this lie, when we promote that those who are different than us are just different. They are less maybe than us. We cannot coexist. They don't believe like us. I keep bringing this discussion back to Palestine and Israel. I've often heard that the conflict is between two ideologies, with one being the Judeo-Christian tradition and the other being Islam. So Israel as a democracy cannot coexist with the Palestinians and so on. And so we must disengage, we must build the wall and separate. And I simply, not just refuse to believe that we cannot coexist as Palestinians and Israelis and even become friends. But I challenge this whole ideology of us versus them, and that, it's one superior group versus the other. The ideology of the wall goes through a process of dehumanizing those on the other side of the wall. You lock them inside, and then demonizing them. They are called like terrorists and other things. And by doing so, you can justify not just locking them inside, but you can justify violence. And peacemakers challenge this ideology by stepping into the other side of the wall, by listening to the other side, humanizing the other side, and amplifying the voices of the other side, especially those who are oppressed and who have been marginalized behind walls. Again, in Palestine and Israel, this is so clear in the physical wall that isolates us as Palestinians. We are locked inside this wall, and it is as if, Israelis can point to us and say, they are the problem, they can't exist with us, they are the terrorists, and so on. And as Christians who seek to be peacemakers, you have to step into the other side and listen to stories and understand the perspectives and challenge that ideology that looks at the conflict in such, or any conflict in such a way. And believe me, many times it takes courage to step into the other side of the wall, because you might be associated with the people you are engaging with and listening to. And you might be, just called out for speaking to them. I can't think of a better example than when Jesus was in this land. Whom did he spend time with? And we should think of this. And many times as Christians, it's as if, we try to be careful whom we meet and whom we listen to. At least go and listen. You don't have to agree with everything, but as Christians, we have to listen equally to both sides. Maybe even give more weight to those who feel oppressed and under oppression. My next point is that as you do so, remember that peacemakers must, at a certain point, take sides. And peacemakers, in doing so, must speak truth and speak it to power. Many times, we Christians are so good at trying to give a balanced perspective. At trying to just say, I've listened to both sides and I'm gonna pray for peace. These are what I call, quote unquote, diplomatic Christians. or as one of my South African friends called them, toothless Christians. Toothless Christians in the sense that they end up saying nothing and moving us or moving the discussion nowhere. Bringing it back to our context, I've so often heard the expression or using the Bible, pray for the peace of Jerusalem whenever there is tension. And I fear that, these prayers that are raised with good intentions, at a certain point, it's not just enough to pray for peace, but you should understand and also at a certain point, not just stay in the middle and say, I pray for this and I pray for that side. But at a certain point, Christians must take sides. When you listen to both sides, you have to decide if this is a conflict or if this is an oppression situation where one group or one person is oppressing another. In our context, there is an occupied and there is an occupier, and we cannot just equate both and simply say, I'm praying for both and hope that you guys can coexist. We must call things, therefore, by their names. And if we continue to avoid that just so that we don't offend one side or the other, I think we are part of the problem. I think we are empowering the aggressors. And so if there is an occupation, it's an occupation. It's not simply a conflict. If several human rights organizations call this a certain thing ethnic cleansing or a certain reality ethnic cleansing or apartheid, then we should speak it out. If there is racism at a certain group, we should call it out. And we can't just say, if I say so, I will offend one side, and we should try to speak language that does not offend both sides if we want to be peacemakers. Again, this is something that's so common among many Christian groups, and I feel it's not just not helping, but it is empowering the aggressors. May I remind you that when Jesus was in our land, he actually offended people sometimes. He called people out sometimes. He wasn't just trying to be non-controversial. Jesus was controversial at a certain points. Oftentimes, when Christians come to us and I explain about the reality under occupation, I say, we're struggling here, we're suffering here, and they respond, but you should modify your language. And I think there is the problem. I'm speaking about my own problem, my own suffering, my own reality, and you're troubled by my language more than you are troubled by my reality. And I think this is where many Christians, by just trying to be balanced or so on, fail to advance the cause of peace. Would like to quote another Jewish figure, Elie Wiesel, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, when he said, "We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe." Very powerful words. Peacemakers then seek justice. And that's my next one. Justice matters. And I strongly believe there is no path to peace without justice. And if I have time just to go to the Bible and show how much justice matters, how much justice is emphasized in both testaments, it's just so clear. I think the prophet Jeremiah equated knowing God with doing justice. Justice and only justice, Deuteronomy says, that you may live and inherit this land. And I always say justice is this is a condition for any nation to live in prosperity in its land. If there is no justice, there is no future. And when I say justice, I'm not calling for revenge, but we can seek out solutions. that bring restoration and restitution to those who've been robbed of certain rights, of certain privileges, or even of certain physical things like land, homes, and so on. We cannot simply ignore the wrongdoing and say, let's move forward, without fixing the problem and trying to restore things as much as we can. And as we seek justice, I have to bring it back to challenging and calling out, even resisting unjust structures, whether they are structures of racism, discrimination, political oppression, economical oppression. If we are to seek peace, we should call them out and challenge them, even resist them. And so, as much as we love to talk about peace, if our talk about peace is not anchored in a desire to seek justice, then I fear that our calls to peace will go in vain. And I mentioned in my previous point that peacemakers seek justice and resist unjust structures. But we should remember that as we do so, we should always resist evil with good. This point, I could have said peacemakers seek non-violence or do things non-violently. But I'd like to take this even forward, because it's not just simply about the concept of non-violence, but it's about engaging the humanity of the aggressor. Remembering that in any reality of conflict or oppression, I believe both sides are victims. Of course, not in the same manner, not in the same sense, and of course, I'm not equating both. But we should seek to liberate both the oppressed and the oppressors. Again, the focus should be on the victims, the oppressed. But as we seek to do so, we remember this is not about revenge. This is not about eliminating the other side or the enemy, but it is about bringing a reality of peace and coexistence. And I strongly believe in the power of resisting evil with good, the power of non-violence, if you wish. Again, this is something you have to see in the Sermon on the Mountain. When Jesus said, turn the other cheek, I believe he's calling us, because what are the alternatives? This is what I always tell my students whenever they are troubled by this verse. I say, isn't this weakness? And I say, okay, if someone slaps you on one cheek, what are your options? You could retaliate, and in a tribal context like ours, retaliation will bring further retaliation, and we are engaging in a cycle of violence that is never ending between tribes, not just individuals. You can withdraw and retreat. Put your head down and feel ashamed and retreat. But Jesus doesn't say that we should do so. Jesus calls us to a third way, a very difficult way, yet I believe a liberating way, in which you say, I refuse to be defeated by this. I refuse to let this dehumanize me. Challenge their humanity and engage them to think again. Should I hit again? Engage in a conversation and challenge that act of aggression. Walking the extra mile is the same thing, because after, Roman soldiers had the authority to ask any person living in the empire under their occupation to walk 1 mile and carry their luggage or suit. After that 1 mile, what are your options? Again, you could withdraw and leave. Or you could say, now I'm doing this as a friend. I'm doing this as a human being, and just again challenge and appeal to the humanity of your aggressor. So I believe there is this place for what Palestinian Christians called creative resistance or non-violent resistance, whether it is civil disobedience, whether it is going through pressure to uphold sanctions or whatever way, and different ways can be applied in different contexts. And I believe people have the right to resist when their freedom and dignity is under attack. But as Christians, we should empower this concept of nonviolent or creative resistance remembering that it is a grassroots movement and it is a joint work. In other words, as I say, engage the humanity of the aggressor. One of the most powerful tools we have is when people from both sides engage in such a stand against oppression. In our context, we have many incidents or examples of Palestinians and Israelis joining hands together to resist the occupation non-violently. And I think that is a very important and key element, because you should always work across divides. And my final point here is that as we seek to challenge unjust structures non-violently in a creative way, seeking the humanity of the aggressors, let us always remember, as we take sides, as we are compassionate, all of that, let's remember what the end goal is. Because it's not simply about ending the conflict or the oppression or the occupation. It's always about what happens next. There is a process. There are first steps. For example, in our situation, I always say, it begins by ending the occupation. It all begins by challenging unjust structures that discriminate between peoples. But ending the occupation or the conflict is not the end point. We all know what peace in the Bible means. It's this reality of shalom, the reality of harmony, living together. It's a reality of reconciliation, of equity, of inclusivity. The way I share it with my students, I always say, my goal is not to end the occupation, but to live not just peace and peace, but maybe for one day for my children to have Israeli friends and live together and play with them and so on. In a reality where we have the same laws, where we both live under the same law, where we both have the same rights. If we are challenging exclusive systems or structures, our response should always be, it's not just to end that, but to create an inclusive reality in its place. In Palestine, I always say in Israel, our goal is to share the land, not simply to end a conflict by dividing it, this is your side into this, my side, but to live and share and accept one another and work together towards a better future for our children. Again, there is a process, and it all begins with ending the conflict, but that is not it. I want to end my presentation by bringing it back to my own experience and why, again, I feel peacemaking is so powerful and important. Yes, I say there will never be peace, but I'm here quoting many, to be honest, many Western Christians who visit our land, listen to the stories or try to understand the conflict and simply say it's complicated, but we know there will never be peace until Christ returns. To me, even though as a child I used to love this answer because it made Jesus look like this superhero who flies in and rescues us and brings peace, but then the more you understand Jesus and you grow up, you understand that this actually doesn't work. This doesn't make sense, because when I say what is at stake, we're talking about lives that are lost on a daily basis. And I have to think not just about, my reality, my neighbors, myself, but my children as well. So what is at stake is so if I am to accept this answer, there will never be peace until Christ returns, I might as well just pack and leave this land. It begs the whole question about this divine intervention thing. Is it what we're hoping for, that until Christ returns there will never? And so today, the more, as I said, I understand Christ, I put it in a way that might sound heretical, and I say to people, I no longer wait for divine intervention. It's not because I don't believe God can and will intervene, but because I believe He has already intervened in our land. This is Bethlehem. I'm speaking from Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. I'm speaking from the land where Jesus started a kingdom that challenges powers and structures. So the intervention has already taken place, and now God calls us to action. And it's very probable that if God is going to intervene, it has to be through us, his instruments. We are God's hands. We are God's voice in this land and in any land. And I'm going to end my presentation by a powerful quote by Palestinian theologian Mitri Rahib, who also pastored at Christmas Lutheran Church. Christians need no longer wait for direct divine intervention, because the intervention has already taken place. The Messiah has come, and there is no need to wait for another. He said what needed to be said, and he did what needed to be done. God did his part. The ball is now in the court of humankind. The transformed faithful are to engage the world, challenge the monopoly of power, and live the life of an already liberated people. Thank you for listening.